The two pins will lend themselves to be a simple configuration. So we'll pick one of these to start with. So the 4-pin short 1 will be a revolve. As mentioned, we'll do this outside shape and then revolve our geometry. So let's go ahead and close the follower coupler. New part in millimeters. Opening up a sketch on the front plane. Now this orientation, we could do these in the top plane and they would come into the assembly a little bit easier. Yeah, we'll just stay with the front plane. Will give us a chance to rotate and manipulate those items going into the assembly. So opening up a sketch on the front plane, whichever method you prefer. When I'm doing the revolves, I default to the center line, vertical, infinite length. We could draw it in the horizontal, but it was also the sketch was given to us in kind of that vertical. And then I'm going to just get out of the center line by going into the right click and select. All right, so we need a starting point. Doesn't really matter. So if we go to on our short pin, it's they're the same size on both, so we could use symmetry. I think that's probably a little more complicated than we need to go. So finding that coincident to the origin, dragging out horizontal, picking the endpoint, coming up vertical, finding the endpoint, coming out horizontal, endpoint vertical, endpoint horizontal. Looking for that inference line, you can kind of see it, that it's pointed back. That does not give me a relation back to that geometry, but it gets me pretty close. All right, so went back to the center line, and if I don't close this off, when I go to complete the revolve, it will ask me. So I will go ahead and go back to the start. Okay, so this geometry is going to be able to move, and I have at least 3 options. So if I go point to point, okay, so endpoint to endpoint, I could make those vertical. If I go point to line, I can make those coincident. And if I go line to line, I can make those collinear. And all 3 of those will have the same net effect. Right, so this is where a lot of the confusion, where a lot of the struggle is you have all of these options. Pick the geometry that makes sense to you. So if I go with my first point to point and make it vertical, now when I drag one, the other one should drag with it. All right, so those are my relations, and I can invert it, and they can do all kinds of weird, strange things if I get too crazy with the drag. So we'll be a little careful with those. Since I have the full object line, where I can, I'm going to go with the object. Secondary would be from line to line, and then last would be from point to point. All right, so depending on your experience in software, probably I get quite a few people that will select point to point, but it's not really your best choice. All right, so I mentioned before this will auto scale. Right now we're at almost 50 millimeters. When I type in 12, it kind of does a little jump and says, okay, you're at 12. Our heights are 5 and 5. All right, so just picking that object, bringing the dimension out and placing it. And if I go to do that last one, and notice it says, do you want to make this dimension driven? Okay. But now that dimension is not participating in the group. I can switch it and say that has a higher priority than the 5, for instance, by right-clicking on the 5 and saying, let's make that a driven dimension, right-clicking on the 2 and unchecking that and saying it's driven. Now I have reversed those and shifted the priorities to where if I try to change that 5, the 2 is going to stay in place. And actually, I should have reversed that. So if we went that way to that way, or that way, or actually I could have, let's see, go driven there and uncheck the driving there, and we'll just verify the overall. All right, so you can play with those dimensions and end up with several different options depending on the strategy. I'm thinking on the configuration for my second long pin that I will I want to be able to just change that dimension and have those two add up to create the new overall. All right, so for my radial diametral dimensions, we'll go back into the smart dimension and I'll pick the geometry. Make sure that you're picking the center line. If you pick the center line, you get radial. You go to the opposite side, you get diametral. And we can place it, and that one will be 10 millimeters. Okay, and then the outside we're staying in diametral, so that one will go to 14. So if you just pick on the line, well, okay, it's still finding my center line. If you just pick on the line, there's no diametral radial, it is only radial. So we'll go ahead and escape out of that because I don't need another driven dimension. And I think we have everything we need. We're fully defined. Go into the features, do our revolve boss base, and create our pin. So for this one, I'm going to go ahead and save. And I'm just going to give it the generic name pin. And the configuration is what's going to draw this out. So this is a simple configuration. We can make configurations very complex or keep them kind of simple. So I always want the default to fall back on. So I'm just going to reproduce this exact same thing. And I need to make sure that I'm at the top level of the pin configuration. Add configuration, and then this will take on the part name. Yeah, I don't like that they didn't keep these consistent, so I'm gonna change it around a little bit. But 4-pin short 1. So I think probably the first number is the quantity, and we'll just simplify the description. We didn't do descriptions in the other ones, but that's okay. And bill of materials option, this will pick up the configuration name, and we'll go ahead and accept. All right, so this is the same. We'll go back to the top level, add configuration. The default and the 4-pin are exactly the same at this stage, so they don't really matter. 1 pin, and long, and well, we'll stay with the 1. Don't know what that's designating, but we'll go with the description pin long. Might need it somewhere. And again, we'll switch to the configuration name, accept it. And when we go look at the dimension, hit the Control 1 and hit the scroll wheel on the mouse pretty quick. When I go to click on this, when I change the 5, notice that we have a little box that says all configurations or this configuration, or if there's multiples, specify which configurations get this change. So when I go into this configuration and I type in 10 and hit rebuild, this is going to bump up a little bit. All right, and if I double click again, I should see that this went to 17. We have the 5s, the 2s, the 10s, everything else stayed the same. I'm going to go ahead and save it again real quick. All right, so the double check is I go from the pin long to the pin short. I should see that adjust, and then of course the pin default doesn't change anything. But if I totally screwed up the configuration elsewhere, I can always go back to the default and have my starting point to work from. All right, so when I go in to set the file properties, this is where I'm going to want to use the configuration specific. Maybe the material is going to always be the same. Okay, so I can put the material in the custom, but typically I kind of start down this path. If I'm using the configuration, I try to put everything in the configuration, but there are going to be some things that it's just going to be easier not to set at every single level. All right, so material, the part number is going to be configuration specific. The mass is not, well, maybe it will. Yeah, I take that back. Mass will. We're going to have the same finish for all of these. All right, and then we'll come over to configuration specific. And sometimes it just, you're going to go through and make these decisions and have to go back and make changes as you realize what the downstream results are. All right, so 1 pin long I just put in for the short. So P16-H17 for the part number, and then we'll put in for the weight and the mass. All right, and that being input, now I should be able to come back to the short and put in its part number, which is now the PS1-100, and we'll update for its weight and mass. Okay, so 1.09, and we'll save it. And that should get us completed on the 2 pins. All right, so just a quick note, the first part of assignment 2 is to create the parts. I'm breaking these down by module so that we can focus on just creating parts. And then when we go to assignment 3, it'll be taking these parts and making the assembly. When we go over to assignment 4, then we'll be making the drawings for the assembly and the parts. So this is going to be kind of a step sequence to get into our completed model.